Welcome to our first podcast on the Constitution. This will be the first installation of a two-part series. Chapter Outline and Learning Objectives. Learning Objective 1. Describe the ideas behind the American Revolution and their role in shaping the Constitution. Learning Objective 2. Analyze how the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation led to its failure. Learning Objective 3. Describe the delegates to the Constitutional Convention and the core ideas they shared. Learning Objective 4. Categorize the issues at the Constitutional Convention and outline the resolutions reached on each type of issue. Learning Objective 5. Analyze how the components of the Madisonian system address the dilemma of reconciling majority rule with the protection of minority interests. Learning Objective 6. Compare and contrast the Federalist and Anti-Federalists in terms of their backgrounds and positions regarding government. Learning Objective 7. Explain how the Constitution can be formally amended and how it changes informally. And finally, Learning Objective 8. Assess whether the Constitution establishes a majoritarian democracy and how it limits the scope of government. In this first podcast on the Constitution, we will be only looking at the first 4 learning objectives. So let's begin. A constitution is a nation's basic law that creates political institutions, assigns or divides powers in government, often provides certain guarantees to citizens, includes an unwritten accumulation of traditions and precedents, sets the broad rule of the game of politics. The road to revolution. The king and parliament originally left almost everything except foreign policy and trade to the discretion of the individual colonial governments. Britain obtained a vast expanse of new territory in North America after the French and Indian War ended in 1763. The British Parliament passed a series of taxes to pay for the cost of defending the territory, and also began to tighten enforcement of its trade regulations. Americans resented the taxes, especially since they had no direct representation in Parliament. The colonists responded by forming the First Continental Congress in September of 1774 and sent delegates from each colony to Philadelphia to discuss the future of relations with Britain. Declaring independence. The Continental Congress met in almost continuous sessions during 1775 and 1776. In May and June of 1776, the Continental Congress began debating resolutions about independence. After 2 days of debate on the wording, the Declaration of Independence, written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, was adopted on July 4, 1776. The English Heritage, the Power of Ideas. John Locke's writing, especially the Second Treatise on Civil Government, profoundly influenced American political leaders. Locke's philosophy was based on a belief in natural rights, the belief that people exist in a state of nature before governments arise, where they are governed only by the laws of nature. Natural law brings natural rights, which include life, liberty, and property. Because natural law is superior to human law, natural law can justify even a challenge to the rule of a tyrannical king. Locke argued that government must be built on the consent of the governed. The people must agree on who their rulers will be. Government should also be limited government, with clear restrictions on what rulers can do. According to Locke, the sole purpose of government was to protect natural rights. In an extreme case, people have a right to revolt against the government that no longer has their consent. But Locke stressed that people should not revolt until injustices become deeply felt. The American Creed. There are a number of close parallels between Locke's thoughts and Jefferson's language in the Declaration of Independence. The sanctity of property was one of a few ideas absent in Jefferson's draft of the Declaration of Independence, but the Lockean concept of property figured prominently at the Constitutional Convention. Jefferson altered Locke's phrase, life, liberty, and property, to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This next slide shows you some parallels between Locke and the Declaration of Independence. Winning independence. Declaring independence merely announced its beginning. The colonists were outnumbered, but won their war of independence. The Conservative Revolution. The Revolution was essentially a conservative movement that did not drastically alter the colonists' way of life. The primary goal of the Revolution was to restore rights the colonists felt were already theirs as British subjects. Now let's turn and look at the government that failed, 1776 to 1787. There were several major causes of the failure of the Articles of Confederation. As we follow this topic, we will be looking at the Articles of Confederation, changes in the states, economic turmoil, and the aborted Annapolis meeting. The Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation established a government dominated by the states. The Articles established a national legislature, the Continental Congress, with one house. States could send up to 7 delegates, but each state had only one vote. The Continental Congress had few powers outside of maintaining an army and a navy, and little money to even do that. It had no power to tax and could not regulate commerce, which inhibited foreign trade and the development of a strong national economy. There was no president and no national court. The weakness of the national government prevented it from dealing with problems that faced the new nation. Changes in the states. Important changes were occurring in the states, including a dramatic increase in democracy and liberty for white males. Expanded political participation brought a new middle class to power, which included artisans and farmers who owned small homesteads. With expanded voting privileges, farmers and craft workers became a decisive majority. Members of the old colonial elite saw their power shrink, and they did not like this. This image shows us the power shift of economic status in state legislators before and after the Revolutionary War. Economic turmoil. A post-war depression had left many small farmers unable to pay their debts. Many were threatened with mortgage foreclosures. State legislators were now under the control of people more sympathetic to debtors. A few states, notably Rhode Island, adopted policies to help debtors, favoring them over creditors. Some printed paper money and passed force acts, requiring creditors to accept the almost worthless money. In 1786, a small group of farmers in western Massachusetts, led by Captain Daniel Shays, rebelled at losing their land to creditors. Shays' rebellion was a series of armed attacks on courthouses to prevent judges from foreclosing on farms. Shays' rebellion spurred the birth of the Constitution because the national government could not do anything to stop this rebellion. The aborted Annapolis meeting. In September 1786, a small group of Continental leaders assembled at Annapolis, Maryland, to consider the problem of commercial conflicts that had arisen among the states. Only 5 states sent delegates, and they issued a call for a full-scale meeting of the states in Philadelphia the following May. It is essential to describe the delegates that met that May in Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention and the core ideas that they shared. Delegates were given specific instructions to meet for the sole and expressed purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. Amendment was not feasible since amending the Articles required the unanimous consent of the states. 12 states sent representatives. Rhode Island refused to participate. The 55 delegates ignored their instructions and began writing a new constitution. James Madison, who is often called the father of the U.S. Constitution, was perhaps the most influential member of the convention in translating political philosophy into government architecture. Gentlemen in Philadelphia, a select group of economic and political notables, met in Philadelphia. Men of wealth. Many were college graduates. Most were coastal residents. A significant number were urbanites. Philosophy into action. Although very different philosophical views were represented, the group agreed on questions of human nature, the causes of political conflict, and the object and nature of a republican government. Human nature. The delegates were united in their belief that people were self-interested and that government should play a key role in checking and containing the natural self-interest of the people. Political conflict. Madison believed that the distribution of wealth, property, is the source of political conflict. Madison claimed that factions arise from the unequal distribution of wealth. One faction is the majority, composed of the many who have little or no property. The other faction is the minority, composed of the few who hold wealth. The delegates believed that either a majority or a minority faction will be tyrannical if it goes unchecked and has too much power. Objects of government. Property must be protected against the tyrannical tendencies of faction. Nature of government. The secret of good government is balanced government, because as long as no faction could seize complete control of government, tyranny could be avoided. There were three major types of issues at the Constitutional Convention, and the United States Constitution resolved these issues. Although the Constitution is silent on equality, some of the most important issues on the policy agenda at Philadelphia concerned equality, representation of the states, what to do about slavery, and whether or not to ensure political equality. The equality issues. Equality and representation of the states. There were two plans that came forth. The New Jersey plan, proposed by William Paterson of New Jersey, called for each state to be equally represented in the new Congress. The Virginia plan, suggested by Edmund Randolph of Virginia, called for the representation in Congress based on the state's share of the American population. This debate went on until finally two men from Connecticut, Roger Sherman and William Johnson, gave us the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise. This was the solution that the delegates adopted. It created a bicameral legislature in which the Senate would have 2 members from each state, and the House of Representatives would have representation based on population. Slavery. The delegates agreed that Congress could limit future importing of slaves. They prohibited it after 1808, but they did not forbid slavery itself. The Constitution stated that persons legally held to service or labor who escaped to free states had to be returned to their owners. Under the famous 3/5 Compromise, both representation and taxation were to be based on the number of free persons plus 3/5 of the number of all other persons. Equality in voting. Some delegates favored suffrage for all free adult males. Some wanted to put property qualifications on the right to vote. Ultimately, they decided to leave the issue to the states. The economic issues. Economic issues played an important role at the conventions. Advocates of the Constitution, aka Federalists, stressed the economy's weaknesses. Opponents of the Constitution, aka Anti-Federalists, who opposed a strong national government, claimed that charges of economic weakness were exaggerated. It is not surprising that the framers of the Constitution would seek to strengthen the economic powers of the new national government, since delegates to the Constitutional Convention were the nation's post-colonial economic elite. Historian Charles Beard argued that the delegates primarily wanted these strong economic powers so that their own wealth would be protected. The best evidence does not support Beard's thesis. The Constitution clearly spelled out the economic powers of Congress. Congress was to be the chief economic policymaker. Congress was granted power to tax and borrow, and to appropriate funds. Congress was also granted powers to protect property rights, powers to punish counterfeiters and pirates, and ensure patents and copyrights, to legislate rules for bankruptcy, and to regulate interstate and foreign commerce. The framers also prohibited practices in the states that they viewed as inhibiting economic development, such as state monetary systems, placing duties on imports from other states, interfering with lawfully contracted debts. States were required to respect civil judgments and contracts made in other states, and to return runaway slaves to their owners, which was overturned by the 13th Amendment. The national government guaranteed that states a Republican form of government to prevent a reoccurrence of Shays' Rebellion, and the new government was obligated to repay all public debts incurred under the Continental Congress and the Articles of Confederation. It was $54 million. The individual rights issues. The delegates felt that preserving individual rights would be relatively easy. They were constructing a limited government that, by design, could not threaten personal freedoms. Powers were dispersed so that each branch or level of government could restrain the others. Most delegates believed that the various states were already protecting individual rights. Although the Constitution says little about personal freedoms, it does include the following. The writ of habeas corpus may not be suspended except during invasion or rebellion. Congress and the states are prohibited from passing bills of attainder, which punish people without a judicial trial, and ex post facto laws, which punish people or increase the penalties for acts that were not illegal or were not as severely punished when the act was committed. Religious qualifications may not be imposed for holding offices in national government. Treason is narrowly defined, and strict rules of evidence for conviction of treason are specified. The right to trial by jury in criminal cases is guaranteed. This concludes our podcast on the Constitution, Part 1. Please join in for our next podcast, the Constitution, Part 2.
I'm Barack Obama, and I approve this message.